Okay, I'll call the meeting back to order and we will go to item H5, paid parking program. Mr. Asarte.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm joined today by Adam Robertson, Communications Advisor, and Greg Burt, our Manager of Protected Services. And we're here to present recommendations for the implementation of the paid parking program. Specifically, we recommend that Council approve the implementation of a paid parking program and the associated parking strategies in 2020 as presented. That Council approve an increase to capital budget 7084 parking management plan implementation of $200,000 to be funded by General Capital Reserve. That Council direct administration to update the reserves policy, Financial 007 to create a parking revenue reserve, and that Council approve fare-free local transit beginning January 1st, 2020 to be funded by paid parking revenues. In previous presentations, I've talked about the justification for the various strategies, and that was the thrust of the strategic planning. Today's presentation is really a focus on details of the specifics of implementation. And those specifics of implementation are focused on meeting a number of goals, which include hitting parking utilization targets from our 2016 and 2018 parking studies, prioritizing high-value use of the available parking stock, reducing traffic congestion during peak season, funding fare-free local transit and other town center investments. The inputs for the recommendation include the work done for the integrated parking management plan, which includes a significant amount of research that's gone into the recommendations by the consultant. It includes destination marketing research. Every aspect of the plan has been informed by numerous workshops and public sessions that have involved key stakeholders from across the downtown, vendor input from Park Plus, and council feedback. So some of this will be a rehash of previous presentations, but it's important just to make clear what's being proposed for the initial implementation. In terms of time regulation, 4 hours is proposed in the green areas shown above, dark green and light green. This is street parking near businesses and fronting residential parking permit zones. All-day parking is proposed in blue areas. This is lot parking, public lots, and streets not directly fronting businesses. Peak season pricing is proposed at $1.50 per hour in the prime green areas, the dark green areas, and $1 per hour elsewhere. And that's May through September inclusive. Pricing off-peak, October through the start of May, would be $1 per hour in the prime green areas only. 4-hour parking is free in all of the other areas. We're proposing a $2 all-day charge or a $10 monthly pass in the all-day blue areas. And that's really just an expectation that those areas are still going to be in demand in the wintertime and that they could be full in the wintertime. And certainly that's something that would be monitored as part of assessing the utilization in those areas to determine if that's warranted.
But everything except the dark green would be 4 hours free.
In the off-season, correct.
Thank you.
The hours for time restriction and pricing were originally proposed as 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we've tweaked those in this final recommendation to be 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that's due to the idea that businesses can actually modify, certain businesses can modify the hours which they provide services. And it was a recommendation that came from a number of businesses. If they had the opportunity to provide service in the morning or after 5 p.m., they could work split shifts or arrange for professional services appointments in those timeframes. And that's entirely consistent with what we're trying to achieve. Occupancy of 85% is shown with a dashed line. That's an ideal that we're aiming for. And currently we see occupancy peaking during the prime hours of midday, but relatively unoccupied in the shoulders of that peak time. And so the idea behind the proposed changes to the hours is that we can encourage more parking into those off-peak times and help spread the parking demand more evenly throughout the day. Though the strategy is price parking, there are actually a significant number of free options that are still available for customers. There's free public parking before 10 a.m. and after 5 p.m., encouraging off-peak use. There are 445 private parking stalls in the town center associated with commercial and mixed-use properties. If a session is concluded in 30 minutes or less, there's no charge. If parking is validated by businesses, say for a physio appointment, that parking could be validated, there would be no charge. And the majority of 4-hour parking is free in that 7-month off-season. And of course, there's the fare-free local transit option. There are also a number of free and heavily discounted options for employees and business owners. Those private commercial parking stalls are utilized as businesses see fit. There's free all-day public parking, 250 stalls available within a short walking distance. A typical employee would arrive at those areas at a time where there is parking available. And then there's the option of a discounted monthly parking pass, and this is for the blue areas. And this is prime all-day parking. There's 355 stalls of that parking. And the discount is approximately 50% during the 5 peak season months. From what would otherwise be $120 a day, it's discounted to $60. And off-peak, it's about a 75% discount to the $2 per day pricing for all-day parking. And again, the option of fare-free local transit. Options for residents in the town center district. And these are the residential units within the town center district itself. So this isn't the residential zoning adjacent to the town center. There are over 200 private stalls associated with residential units in the town center. The count's a little tricky. There are a number of garages and parkades throughout the town center, and so this is an approximate number. And the monthly pass system, discounted pass system, is also available to residents within the town center. And for parking 30 days, the discount would be 66% to all-day parking and 85% in the off-peak time. So the discount's higher with the same pricing because it's assuming a 30-day use for residents, full-time use, as opposed to an employee that would be using it typically 20 times per month. Options for validation of parking. So there are many payment options. We've talked about those before. There's also 2 validation options. The first is to park a friend. And this is a very simple option that anyone can use, not just a business. And if you have the app on your phone and you have an account, you can simply just punch in the zone that the person's parked in, their license plate, and their duration, and hit start. The charges will go to your account and you've parked them. Their license plate is registered.
Do you mind if we interrupt with questions?
Sure.
So in that instance, could the friend put in like a time limit? Or would it be the whole session that would be charged to the friend's account?
They can specify a specific time.
Okay, thanks.
That's in the duration field. So there'll be a drop down there providing options for the duration. So if it's a 1-hour physio appointment, they could drop down and select an hour. And the second option, which is probably more appropriate for, say, an optometrist, would be an online activation. At the time that the appointment is made, the professional services could simply book that customer into a parking area for a specific time. So if they said, park behind the Visitor Information Center, your parking session will be free, they can activate it in advance, and when the time comes, it's automatically in the calendar and it's automatically registered.
And if I understand, that system directs the vehicle to a specific location, and if there are no spots in that location, then what happens?
There's a caveat on the website, the Calgary website right now, that it doesn't guarantee a parking spot will be available there, and they're responsible for paying for parking if they can't find one in that zone. If that happened, then they could let the business know, and that would provide them an option to do the park a friend instead.
Okay.
If, generally speaking, if we're being successful in hitting utilization, that shouldn't be a regular issue.
Councilor McCallum?
Are we going to be charging for partial hours?
Yes, there are options to select partial hours, and there's also options to close sessions before the time frame that you've specified is concluded to be charged for partial
So you can
sessions.
be charged for actually what you're using? Okay.
Exactly.
So for instance, if somebody's going in for a massage appointment and it's a 1 hour massage, and that first half hour is gratis of that 1 hour that they would be parked, and then the following half hour, 45 minutes, would be charged if you're parking a friend or yourself?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Speaking of which, so first 30 minutes at the last meeting, council indicated a preference for having widespread availability of first 30 minutes free. And this desire to have no cost for a quick session is entirely consistent with the goals of the plan, which are to prioritize that near-door parking use for high turnover customer visits, pickup, drop-off, deliveries, etc. There are some software app limitations with the vendor, and so they've worked through this in two cases. One would be for the 30-minute zones in Inglewood, for example, and the other is they looked at having a no-cost option on the app for loading zones because they're finding that people were parking over duration in loading zones, so they wanted a way to be able to enforce that. And they ran into challenges with the app itself, and so they've come up with workarounds, and they're a little bit onerous. They require you to use the website or text or phone to start and stop a session, which is what is explained in the option analysis that they provided. We do need registration in order to enforce the larger system because it becomes really onerous and difficult to enforce if we don't have registration for short-term parking. So they're looking at the opportunities to customize the app to allow for that. Any customization impacts their entire user base, and so they've just cautioned that if they can't find a workaround for it, that we may be limited to some of the more onerous start-stop options. So there may be another option, which is to tier our pricing so that the pricing increases the longer the duration. So if you park for your first 30 minutes could be some very small nominal amount, and then after that the costs, depending on the length of your stay, increase up to the full charge. And the vendor says that option is probably the easiest path because it doesn't require reconfiguration. It's simply a matter of setting an escalating price scale. So the first 30 minutes could be 5 or 10 cents or 25 cents or whatever the number is. The benefit of that is you only have to punch into the app once. And so you click to start a session, you select your duration, 30 minutes, there's a small charge to your account, and then you're able to park for that time and you get the warnings, but you don't have to stop the session. So it sounds a little bit strange, but there's some software things going on in the background. They've already explored them in 2 other areas, so it sounds like there's some challenges with the just making it 30 minutes and start a session and you don't have to worry about it. You would have to start and stop a session, and you'd have to use a machine, text, phone, or the website to do that.
Sounds complicated.
So a simpler approach might be just a small charge. And this is really geared for locals who are up on an app, who can take advantage of the convenience of the app to park downtown. They have $20 in their account is, I think, the typical amount you load. that would be good for 200 half-hour sessions or whatever the case is if we did 10 cents for the first half hour and tier pricing up from there.
But if somebody doesn't have the app, is app challenged?
So then they're back to the other options, which are pay machine or using call-in or texting.
So would the pay machine have that essentially free option?
Yes.
I would,
Councillor McCallum?
I would say that the purpose of the half-hour free is basically a way to ensure people are registered on the app, and that's the benefit of being registered on the app. If you're not registered on the app, then you pay for that half hour. Like, that's how I've seen it work in Englewood. It's been a year since I've been there, but so if you look at the signage, activate your Park Plus session to receive 30 minutes free. So it's basically, you're getting 30 minutes free if you register the app. If you want to do it in a more onerous way, you're not going to get your 30 minutes free. It's to basically, I think.
That's not what we're hearing though from Mr. Sarti.
The Inglewood one works because it's a contained area, if I understand, and there's a pay machine there that people are required to use. You can't actually use the app in that case. And what I'm suggesting is that we would like people to be able to use the app, and in order to use the app, they would be required to have some payment. It could be a cent, but it needs to be some payment. You start your session, you select 30-minute duration, and you go. Now it's done. You don't have to remember to stop your session in order to avoid it continuing to charge your account afterwards. In Inglewood, you can activate a 30-minute session with the machine, or you can start a session with one of those other methods that's not the app. That was what I was told. It's the app in particular that you can't use. And it's because if they make that change and allow $0 value sessions, it'll take effect across the entire system. So all zones would then have that option. And then people wouldn't need to load money onto their account. And so then you'd have a bunch of people using those areas for free, unlimited, is the way it was explained to me.
So the streets in Calgary are free after a certain hour.
That's right.
So when I park on the street in downtown Calgary after 6 o'clock, I think it's 6 o'clock,
You don't need to do anything in that case.
I actually use the app.
Maybe you don't need to.
Clearly I don't.
I don't think you need to.
Huh,
There's no charge.
interesting,
so-
okay.
Yeah, there would be no enforcement at that time. Unless there was a time restriction. That would be the only, there might not be a cost, but if it was. That's right. That's right. So certainly there are options for us. My recommendation is that we pursue an option that allows us to use the app and allows it to be a single interaction with the app, so that we're not requiring people to either go to a pay machine or to touch the system twice to start and stop a session. From a user perspective, that would be far more convenient, even if it meant paying a small amount for that first half hour.
Councillor Hillstead?
Is there any option to basically have both? So if someone doesn't want to load up like money onto their account, they can just, make sure to do their stop and start time, and also have it so if someone's, worried that they may forget, they can just do the nominal fee?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, because if that's a possibility, then it's up to the user to decide if they want to spend whatever nominal fee it is or make sure that they stop and start their session. So
I believe the answer is yes. You can configure it for both.
thank you.
It's a good idea. Managing spillover. So there are two types of spillover that it's very important, speaking with businesses and the BIA. The first is private parking areas. So we have those 400 plus stalls of private parking. Already today, it's a challenge managing spillover into those areas. So those are people who are parking in in contradiction to whatever posted regulations that the private property owners have put on their site in order to restrict parking use. At present, our bylaw doesn't permit us to do enforcement on those private areas. However, Mr. Burt is looking into changes to the bylaw that would allow that. With that system, the onus is still on the private landowner to proactively sign and monitor their parking. And enforcement would be strictly by request. So they're identifying that they're having a problem. They've done work to try to remedy it. The last resort is to contact bylaw. And so these won't be patrolled, these areas. It'll strictly be an option for businesses to be able to have support from bylaw for enforcement. The fine revenue from enforcement in general is still required in order to fund those seasonal positions and to fund the program. Our expectation and our assumptions is that there will not be an increase in fine revenue with the new program. We've assumed that revenues will be consistent with assumptions made in the budget, and we'll monitor that. And if there's a deviation either way, we'll be back to discuss that with council. The second spillover is managing the residential zones around the town center. And we've shown the properties that are primarily affected as a first street beyond the town center zoning in the hatched shading. And the idea with these zones is that we would have them signed 4-hour with payment required during the payment time of the town center, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that's to encourage people to use the town center parking first and only use the parking in the adjacent residential neighborhoods at peak times. So these are our long weekends, busy weekends in the summertime. Residents on these blocks are permitted to have 2 vehicles, 2 license plates in the system, and that would be for free. And then each additional vehicle would require a permit, and that would be $100 for 2 years. The recommendations here are strictly based off of the system that Calgary has in place right now. So we've essentially mirrored that.
And we talked about this before, but there's no opportunity to do something similar for residential use on Main Street and 10th Street?
The option for residential units in the town center zoning is the discounted monthly passes. So they still have the option to be able to park within the town center, but to be equitable, we're treating the town center, all units, all employees, all customers of the town center who are looking for the ability to store cars long-term on public lands to have the same system, and that's the $60 discounted monthly pass.
But on the 7th Street and 8th Avenue, it's a free pass.
These are residentially zoned areas outside of the town center district. And so as a residential zone, you expect that there's going to be spillover into your neighborhood and that you're part of the downtown. What you don't want to happen is people to be preferentially parking in residential neighborhoods over parking in the available parking in the town center. You want people to use residential neighborhoods for parking strictly as it's an overflow when the downtown is absolutely full.
And let's, for argument's sake, consider all homeowners along 7th get their 2 passes and use them both. How many stalls would be left in general?
There aren't enough stalls on that block face now. The rule is that essentially you can park on your block face only. It doesn't allow you to park anywhere else in the town center, and so your residential parking permit is linked to the street frontage outside your home. There wouldn't be sufficient space for each homeowner on that block to park 2 cars, and there's no guarantee with the residential parking permit program that there will be any stalls available for those residents. But what it does do is ensure that people are choosing to park in those areas only as a last resort if there isn't similar parking available closer to the downtown.
Great. So if you're a resident on that street and there happens to be a parking space available, then you can park there without a fee.
Correct.
And if there's no spots, You park somewhere else.
Presumably, there's one spot for each unit on site. And so,
Presumably.
the expectation is still that residents
Right.
in residential areas are using their on-site residential parking as a primary parking source.
Okay.
Residents in those areas, generally speaking, would have visitors in off-peak times, and so there would be no charge for visitors to park in those streets or in the vicinity of their home. However, if they did have a visitor look to park during peak times, there is an option for us to have a visitor pass program, which would allow them in a similar way to parking a friend, be able to park a visitor to their property. Schedule for rollout, public communications are ongoing, and this is communications around education, around how the system will work, education around options, how to use the app, and so forth. May, the residential parking system would be in place, and that would just allow us to get out in front of spillover impacts. At that time, we would have bylaws in place that would allow for enforcement on private property. In June, pricing and regulation would come into effect, and then after the peak season, we would take information collected from residents and businesses, do some formal reach out at that time, and use the evaluation of utilization from the summer to evaluate the program. In terms of next steps functionally, we would evaluate accessible stall numbers and locations, develop detailed signage and wayfinding plans, update those bylaws, order equipment and configure software, tender for signage and installation. There's training for bylaw staff and that communications program that I mentioned. And so this is the cycle for after implementation, the monitoring. There would be the opportunity for in-season and even pre-season tweaks and changes. The idea here is that we're targeting utilization, and we've taken a best stab at what the right numbers are in terms of hours and locations and pricing. There may be a need for in-season tweaks and changes to ensure that we're on the right track. Collecting feedback, that fall evaluation, and that would feed into an update for the next season. Financial impacts include capital costs for implementation of $300,000, operating costs estimated at approximately $8,000 per month plus transaction fees. There's a net revenue estimate of $200,000 to $350,000. That's been adjusted from the last report to account for the 30-minute free period, decreasing the number of hours of charged parking, and also the shrinking of the duration of the period of paid parking. These net revenues can vary significantly depending on how we see utilization working, the hours, prices, and zones. So as we make tweaks and changes, that could have a really big impact, and how it's ultimately used can have a really big impact on the net revenues. So what we've done is made conservative estimates of based on utilization and the information that's been presented to come up with those numbers. The fair portion of transit costs is $97,700, and that's the portion of the total local transit system costs that is recommended to be funded from net revenues. The remainder of net revenues, it's recommended that they're put into a reserve, and that any fine revenues, as I mentioned previously, support enforcement activities only. For the reserve, it's recommended that a reserve policy be amended to include a reserve for parking revenues, and that the funds are reinvested into the town center. Fair portion of local transit, maintenance of parking areas, investment into transportation strategies, town center enhancement.
Do you think it's necessary to have that reserve in place before the program starts?
The intent would be at some point in 2020 to establish the reserve. The accounting for net revenues will be available at any time for council to review. Really, it's just a way to keep things clean and transparent in terms of where those dollars are coming and going. And we think that's very important for the BIA and our downtown stakeholders, that they can see that. And then, as I'm recommending here, the spending of those funds is entirely at council's discretion. In other jurisdictions, they use it for general road maintenance in the community, general revenues. What we're recommending is that it be reinvested into the places where the revenues are collected. We think in the long term that's going to prove to make our downtown and our community successful. And the spending be at the discretion of council with recommendations from the transportation working group. So working with our key stakeholders, we'll look at the revenues, have some guidelines with the policy, and make recommendations to council as to what, as a working group, the priorities of that group are.
Remind me who's on the transportation working group?
The participants over the last few years have been CHLA, the BIA, BODA, Chamber, Town of Canmore, various departments of the Town of Canmore. And we haven't always had participation from the outside groups, but certainly heavy participation from the BIA. We see them kind of as a primary stakeholder in those decisions. And just before I close, a reminder that these strategies are part of a larger set of strategies. This isn't a silver bullet. This isn't a one-off. It's really part of a comprehensive plan that's looking at a number of different ways that we can sustainably, in the long term, manage parking and transportation in our community with the significant challenges that we face, and in a way that's consistent with our values. And so the things we see next up are focusing on increasing the stock of intercept parking, working with the CHLA on something that I think is a very valuable opportunity, and that's to improve the communication to hotel guests. All of our overnight parking, or a majority of our overnight parking, is a short walking distance to the town center, so can we encourage people to leave their cars there and take walking routes and have improved mapping to get downtown? And then working with the BIA, so this process will create an incentive structure for the better management of those private parking stalls that are out there. And so by creating an incentive structure, if we can have the BIA take a lead role, or the businesses in the downtown take a lead role in working out how to better manage all that private stock, because there's certainly opportunities for a professional services building to have their parking available to employees that are working on the weekend when those offices are closed, and vice versa. So what opportunities are out there to broker, and that was a recommendation of the strategy, broker sharing. That sharing only happens when there's incentive, and the incentive comes from regulation and pricing.
Councillor Mera?
I just want a clarification. So net revenue will fund 100% of fare-free transit, and then there'll be percentages divided up into downtown enhancements and other areas. Am I correct?
At this point, all we're suggesting is that of the net revenues, 200,000 to 350,000. Of those net revenues, we use 97,700 to fund the fare portion of local transit. For the remainder, to put it into a reserve. The rules around how that reserve is spent would be determined as part of the amendments to the policy.
Okay. Thank you.
And with that, I'll conclude the presentation and open for questions.
Great. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Asarte. One of the things that we have downtown are 15-minute parking zones. What is the strategy going to be with those?
So in the original recommendation, we suggested perhaps looking at additional 30-minute parking zones, as opposed to having 30 minutes, first 30 minutes free. However, I like better the option that people can park in any available parking stall, as opposed to having fixed areas with defined short-term parking. you can imagine those areas being the go-to for people, and when they can't find a spot there, then they start their hunt. So I do like the idea of it being more flexible, all of the spots being available for short-term parking. At this point, what we've proposed is two 15-minute zones, and essentially those are adjacent to government facilities, the Civic Center and the post office where they presently exist. So it wouldn't be a change to the current 15-minute zoning in the town center. We have looked at, with the BIA, the loading zones on 10th Street and the desire to add a loading zone on 9th Street. And we'll continue to develop that plan going forward as part of looking at overall regulation. So we do want to designate perhaps an additional 1 or 2 locations for deliveries on laneways or inappropriate areas downtown. But at this point, I would recommend sticking with the 15-minute zones we have and looking at making a convenient 30-minute option that offers the most flexibility. And
I think you answered this question already, but you're pretty certain that you can do both ways of accessing that 30-minute free zone?
Yeah,
with
with the
the
app
text?
with a small charge,
Yeah.
and the other options that are already in use in Inglewood.
And that fits with the Park Plus system?
Correct.
So everything we do has to kind of blend with that whole Park Plus.
The benefit of going with a big system is that you get to leverage the big system, but we're a small fish now with a bigger vendor. And so they need to make sure that the changes we make fit with their overall system.
But our Park Plus is compatible with Calgary's system, correct? And so
Correct.
Calgarians that come out here will understand it because they might even have an account by when they come out here.
We were provided an option to white label our app, which is what Edmonton has done. It means
Mhm.
that Edmontonians have a separate app that they need to download for their area, and we decided that for ease of use, we're just going to use the Park Plus branding, the Park Plus app, and so absolutely, Calgarians will be able to come out here seamlessly and use our zones.
Can I just ask also, if you have a household account, can you register more than one license plate on the same account, or does it have to be individual license be registered?
Each license plate gets registered. It's not a hang tag, it's associated with a specific license plate, and that can't be changed.
Okay, so if you have 2 cars, you have to register both vehicles?
Correct.
So if you're doing monthly parking, you have to register both your vehicles for monthly parking? Okay, thank you.
Just following up on that thought, so presumably the same app would work for us if we go to Calgary?
Correct.
And also keying off of thought of Councillor Sanford's there. So, and this was, there were a number of concerns that have been shared with council over the last few days. There's one here that I'm not even sure what's in mind, but there's the suggestion that people who live in resident permit areas whose vehicles are registered to other addresses would create a problem with the permit system. Is that something that strikes you as an issue, or?
I have to double check the specifics of how that's done. However, I believe your vehicle needs to be registered to that address in order for you, so that's the cross-check that we would do on our end. They've applied for a residential parking permit for this block face. Is that license plate registered to an address on that block face? If it's not, then they wouldn't be able to have a permit for it.
So then arguably, if somebody moves to that block from elsewhere, they would have to make a point of updating their registration with
Correct.
Alberta vehicles.
Correct.
Thanks. Councillor Mara.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. This is more maybe a bylaw question for spillover. So a business can phone up Monday to Sunday, and what will be the enforcement level if they say, this vehicle's been parked here the last 6 days for 8 hours a day, and I've left notes and there's no response? What is going to be your response?
We still have to work out the details of it, but you're pretty bang on in terms of providing them with what would be required for signage first, ensuring that that signage is up. We may require them to take some sort of steps first, i.e. affixing their own warning notice to that vehicle, and then failure to do so could result in them contacting us, and we would deal with it just like we do with abandoned vehicles on streets, etc. And again, you've heard me say it many times, taking the educational approach of trying to provide some education on parking in private parking areas, potentially issuing a warning, and if not, then issuing a ticket, and finally, if the vehicle's still there or it's a repeat offender, towing the vehicle from the property.
Okay, so I see this still being a long process, other than ticketing if you're in a 4-hour zone over the 4 hours. Is that correct?
I would say it's definitely more onerous than, say, a vehicle that was parked in front of a no parking zone, is we would need to do our due diligence to get down there and deal with it, and it's something we'll need to monitor as if we take this on and tackle it, as to what resources we would need to put to this.
Okay. And will we be reaching out to the business owners that have private lots to, inform them of what they require for signage?
Yep, absolutely. Working with Mr. Zarte and the BIA, those are areas that we'd be looking at. And it definitely, I'm cautious on this as well, recognizing that it can expand beyond just the downtown paid parking zone. I've heard concerns from other businesses in other areas where people are parking. An example that would be the shops at Canmore, where they have a 2 or a 4 hour limit, and I've heard concerns about people parking, leaving their vehicles, commuters hopping on the Rome bus and traveling into Banff. So I think it's an area that it's kind of going into a little bit of a unknown as to what the resources will look like. So we're just approaching it cautiously.
Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. A lot of my questions have been answered already, but one I had was if you could confirm the process behind and the number of handicapped parking spots that are in the core.
I believe there are building code requirements in terms of the number of spots, typically on, say, a commercial site. I'm not aware of any for public land, but we would use a framework like that to determine what the total demand would be, and then try to match that with an appropriate number of stalls in the appropriate spots.
So we have our stalls are already that are handicap stalls that are in public parking, like on Main Street, et cetera. Are those going to change, or?
Likely not,
Okay.
unless they're in a spot, for example, we've shifted one for a parklet. It may make more sense to have it around the corner where there's better access to the ramp. So as part of the review, we'll look at numbers and locations to make sure that those are still the convenient spots, still accessible, or as accessible as they can be with our current infrastructure.
And so the stalls themselves will be free if you have a vehicle registered to your tag?
Correct.
Okay. And so confirm for me, are those tags actually aligned with license plates? Like if I go into registry with a note from my doctor, I think this is the process, I believe. And they say, yep, we're going to get you a handicap sticker for your car. It's specific to the car, not to the person, or is it to the person, not the car?
My understanding is it's to the user. So it's a hang tag
Okay.
that's specific to the user,
Okay.
someone that's with the user. So if you have one and you and I need to go somewhere and park and you have a legitimate reason, you can hang that tag on my
Okay.
vehicle as long as you're with me.
Okay.
So it's
from an
not tied to the license plate
Yeah,
of
I
the
just wanted to
vehicle.
double check. So from an enforcement perspective, staff would be looking at a vehicle that's sitting in a handicap stall, and they would see the hang tag, and that would be the end of that. There would be no, like, they haven't paid because it's free if you have a handicap tag, and I'm just working through it here in my head. And
So I don't foresee any changes currently. We see vehicles all the time
Yeah.
in handicap accessible stalls, and there's a number of things we look for. So there's hang tags, there's passes that go on the dash. Some license plates from out of the jurisdiction have it on their license plate,
Yes.
so we need
Yeah.
to do that kind of 360 walk around. And like I was saying in the previous committee of the whole meeting, there have been a few occasions, I'm not sure of the exact
You're
number,
saying.
of something isn't lining up here, which then won't let you in on all the trade secrets, but there's another way of being able to run that tag to determine what the purpose is for. And we do have the ability to do a bit more investigative work. It doesn't happen often, right? But sometimes you're like, why are there two able-bodied 20-year-olds coming out of this vehicle? That just makes me get a bit inquisitive, and really the officers get inquisitive. And like I said, there's the ability to do a little bit more research and digging on that.
And
Last
of
thing we
course-
want is people abusing those stalls.
Yes,
for people that
absolutely.
legitimately
Yeah,
need
for
them.
sure. And then a lot of people, at first glance, they may not seem like they have a disability as
No.
well. You have no idea
No,
what it is they're
absolutely not.
managing or whatnot.
No, I can guarantee you that we're not walking up and saying, hey, you know, what's going on here? But
You, where's
yeah.
your wheelchair? That's not
Again,
good.
I raise that just to say, for your benefit and also for members of the public that, we will keep an eye on that.
All right, thank you
Okay.
very much.
Councillor Mara.
This is for Andy, Mr. Sarte. When it comes to validation, I see that it's fairly easy to, but a business also, they don't have to do validation, but they could offer their client, if they're for a massage, you're here parking for an hour, hour and a half, I can take $1 off my price. Because they already have their account, the customer already has an account with the parking system, so they could just offer, say, come on down, I'll take $1 off your. That's an
Certainly
opportunity.
another
that's
option for
Another option for
validation.
them. Okay.
Yeah, and we can include that in communications.
Yeah, thank you.
As an option.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I had another question for you, Mr. Asarte, regarding the handicap parking. Currently, we have a certain number of handicap spots, correct?
Correct.
And anybody that comes from out of town is using those handicap spots currently, right? So having free handicap spots really isn't going to change very much because we already have a certain number. Our community is using them, our visitors are using them. It's not going to create more demand on the handicap parking?
The thing we'll need to keep an eye on is that it's now 4 hour as opposed to 2 hour. And so if we're seeing that the stays are longer, that's great. If those are customers that are coming down and enjoying the downtown for longer, that's the intent. But it may mean that there's higher utilization on those spots, and that would be something to monitor. The approach Banff is proposing is to price those spots as they are, as all the spots are, to encourage turnover. And that was the recommendation of our consultant as well, to encourage turnover. We've taken a different approach here and made a different recommendation, and that will mean that we need to keep a close eye on utilization to make sure that we're getting enough turnover, that there are spots available for people who need them.
So our new handicap spots will be 2 hour, did you say, or 4 hour?
They'll be 4 hour.
Okay, so 4 hour.
Yeah.
And right now, is there a time limit on them?
They're 2 hour.
Okay. So there might be some changes of utilization, even though we're having visitors and locals use them currently.
Correct.
If a company has a fleet vehicle or some fleet vehicles, would they be able to use the public parking differently than how they're using it if it's just private vehicles? Because some companies who are downtown might have fleet vehicles that they can have for their employees to go out on service calls, et cetera, back and forth to the office. Is there any option for them to have dedicated parking for a fleet vehicle?
It's a good question, and certainly that would be a good option for a number of businesses. The town of Canmore, for example, uses that option and allows a lot of the staff here to be able to come down without a car. Our approach at this point has been that even if it's a fleet vehicle, including the town's fleet vehicles, they're there for employees and would be required to pay a monthly charge just as any other vehicle. It's an equity thing and a fairness thing. However, if we wanted to incentivize that, that's certainly something we could look at. I'm not sure how many there would be, but if there was an opportunity to eliminate 3 or 4 cars parking under 3 or 4 permits with a single car parking without a permit, then that would be something that I'd be open to exploring for sure.
So that's something you could work through as you work into the program next year?
Yeah,
Okay.
something we can review.
Can I ask one more question?
That,
If you had a parking pass that you could acquire for $10 a month in the winter, how long can you park your vehicle there without moving it? Because I'm concerned that some people might just use that as a easy way to store a vehicle for the winter, if it's only $10 a month, because it's more expensive everywhere else.
The same long-term parking requirements would apply, if I understand correctly, of 72 hours maximum?
That's a great question. That's something that we're working through right now in conversation with Park Plus in Calgary, where they have monthly rates. They've included some stipulations that vehicles need to be moved at different intervals. So again, that's something that we're taking away from this, both from a long-term parking and also from an overnight parking perspective from the program that will be coming before council in the new year on the overnight parking program. So trying to look at both of those, but great question that we're still sorting out. Last thing we want is to have a number of people parking and storing their vehicles for 30 days on end.
Yeah, because that would defeat our purpose of having downtown parking.
Mhm.
And then if people say, you can't park an unregistered vehicle in a public parking lot anyway, right? Like you have to have it registered
Correct.
and insured, so
Yes.
that would be one mechanism of ensuring that people don't park long-term without registering.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
any other questions from council at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation and all the work you've been doing on this initiative. So at this point, I'll move into the motions, and I'll put forward several. First being, I'll move the council approve the implementation of a paid parking program and associated parking strategies in 2020 as presented. And I'll speak in support of that motion. I firmly believe that over time and as we learn a bit more about the implementation and tweak it or perhaps modify it, over time the concern that we hear voiced from some members of the community will dissipate because I believe that at this point I regularly hear from friends in Canmore that they just don't come downtown anymore. It's just too congested, it's too hard to get parking. And so in that sense, we're losing that sense of the heart of the community. And by reducing the congestion downtown and making it easier to find a parking stall if you have to drive, I think we'll be reinvigorating and re-enhancing the downtown so it continues to be the vibrant heart of our community that we all want it to be. I've certainly had concerns or conversations with specific business owners in the downtown core that I would suggest, and I did suggest in conversation, that they're jumping to worst case scenario, and I'm encouraging business owners to just let it roll out and see how it plays out, whether or not it has the negative impact on their own business that they fear, and reassure the businesses that administration will be monitoring and will be finding improvements as time moves on. It certainly was encouraging to have general support voiced by the Downtown Business Association, and independently I've heard from a number of downtown business owners who have expressed support. Along with so many things that are happening in Canmore, this is a transitional change, and change is always hard to deal with. But we can't wait until it really is a dire situation to put in place some sort of mechanism to control that growing congestion. So while I'm not 100% certain how this will play out, I am 100% confident in administration to monitor the program and moderate it effectively. And again, I'll suggest that in time, people will see that this really has been a good change for downtown Canmore. So I'll support the implementation of paid parking. Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. I too will support the implementation of paid parking. This is something that we've been talking about for several years, and something that we've gained a lot of feedback from the public about. And I think that the initial program, and I use the word initial because I do believe it's going to morph and change based on how it's used and who uses it, really tries to find balance in terms of the wants, the needs of the local Canmorite and the wants of the local Canmorite. And I think that those are two different things in terms of what people expect when they're looking for parking. I've seen paid parking in communities much smaller than ours rolled out for 15, nearly 20 years. And those downtowns are vibrant. I think of the city of Nelson in particular. I know that Sylvan Lake has had it for several years. And their prices are actually higher than ours, that what we're proposing. And they have very different downtowns than ours, but it works, and it's become normal. There is no such thing as free parking. We all know that there is a cost associated with that. And if we can derive a bit of revenue from tourists, which is what we hear from locals all the time, and we can use that to improve quality of life overall for overall people in Canmore, giving them the opportunity to get on fare-free transit, etc., then I think that that is a win. We are not going to make all of the people happy all of the time with this program. We cannot tailor it to every single individual situation for every single individual business or individual Canmorite, but we can do our best, which I think we have, in creating a program that will morph and change as people use it, that will help deal with congestion in our downtown core. And that is why I am supporting the first recommendation today.
Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. We've been talking about this for a long time, and I think we've turned this issue over and over and looked at it from so many different ways. I think the efforts that have been made, both through data collection, aligning with our transportation plans, all the things that have been done have led us to a place where I think administration has brought us some good recommendations. I would be happy to support this because I think if we incentivize what's free, which is from this program will be transit, people will figure out how to get something for free. And it might actually be really good for us for people to use those free services like cycling, walking, and free transit to move our transportation concepts forward in a way that benefits the whole community. And if you need to drive, and many people do, and you know it's not a problem if you do, then you have the luxury of paying for the privilege, as well as moving some of these other initiatives forward. I know that through the Rome transit system, whenever transit is offered for free, there's a much bigger uptake on that transit option. And so if you want to figure out how to make it free for yourself, figure out what your transit route's going to be and maximize that opportunity. Also, I think people, if they want to come downtown and they know that for $1 or $2 or $3, They can get parking for sure, not have to be driving around looking for it. They want to make a quick trip, they want to make a social visit, they want to come down and be part of the vibe and the scene, then they know that there's going to be options for them to pay for that, as well as if you want to carpool, if you want to do your business outside of the regular parking hours, if you want to conduct your business at the bank. If you want to go to the post office, there's still a 15-minute free parking area. If you want to come to the Civic Center, there's still a free 15-minute free parking area. But you can adjust your day around the schedule that best suits you. So if you would like to pay for that option, it's there. If you don't want to pay for that option, then you're going to figure out better ways to do it. And I think to incentivize free is the opportunity here. So thanks for bringing that forward. I will support it.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I will also support this first motion. I've seen this strategy work very well in other communities, and it's nice to have a parking management plan, and I think that's what we're moving into. Visitors to our town, coming in town that aren't familiar, they'll be able to find available parking. There's lots of reasons to support it, and I'm looking forward to it.
Councillor Mara.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I first would like to thank Mr. Sarte and administration. I have witnessed that he has, and administration has listened. I've seen it sort of do a bit of this since I come on board, because I think I was a bit of a stop when it came to this, when I first came on board. A couple things that stood out for me that was mentioned at our meetings is it's also the product that's downtown. What's bringing them downtown? So we have to think about that too. And now we'll have convenience of place to park, and it's affordable. And like Councillor McCallum said, and Councillor Sanford, is we find ways to come down and park, and if we want to be part of it, we will. So if we have 6 minutes to walk in, or, if we still choose to drive, for those who do drive. And I like the idea of support for the private parking lots, and that we're willing to work with those private people and private spots, and help them figure the way how they can manage their businesses. So, thank you.
Councillor Hillstead.
I will also support this motion. I'm hoping that it will help with congestion, as that is one of the main reasons that we're looking at implementing this. I think that if the loan congestion goes down because of this, with people not needing to search for parking everywhere, that'll be definitely good. And then at the same time, we'll hopefully be able to reinvest into our downtown with the net proceeds. So that's also a bonus. So I think there's a lot of upside. Yes, there's definitely some downsides. No one likes to pay for things. That's just how we are as humans. But we have to do it anyways through other taxes or other means. So I think there's enough benefits here to go ahead with it. So thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll then move that council approve an increase to capital budget 7084 parking management plan implementation of $200,000 to be funded by general capital reserve. Is there discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll move the council direct administration to update the reserves policy FIN-007 to create a parking revenue reserve. Discussion on that motion. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So question through the Chair to the administration, when do you expect this to be brought forward for council approval? Sometime, oh, right, finance, hello.
I think that will be me. So I think there were some questions earlier about the timing for getting the reserve set up. I'd really like to have this set up before parking goes live in June, so sometime in the spring. I think there's also some questions on the administration side about our, how we set up the reporting, how we want to track these also from our chart of accounts perspective. So I would propose that before this is implemented, we would be coming back with the changes to the reserve policy and some of those details.
So speaking to the motion then, to update the reserves policy to create a parking revenue reserve. Is there a discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll move that council approve fare-free local transit beginning January 1st, 2020 to be funded by paid parking revenues. Is there discussion on that motion? I'll speak briefly to that because it is a little separate from the previous motions, and Councillor Sanford touched on it. The local transit that we initiated several years ago has proven to be a very positive change in the town. When we started off, we were really uncertain how it was going to play out. But the reception has been good, and it's had a positive impact on not only downtown, but transportation in general. And as you noted, Councillor, with the implementation of fare-free transit, it's become even more positive an experience. There is a direct link between the paid parking and the transit. And one of the points about this, one of the aspects of it that appeals to me is we then, through paid parking, which will largely be paid by visitors, will be offsetting the costs of our free transit, which benefits by and large locals. So I like that. A number of other things I like, but I'll be quite happy to support this motion. So the discussion on the motion, Councillor McCallum.
Thank you. So I would be so excited to support recommendation 4. The fare-free local transit that we've been enjoying in Canmore for the last 2.5 years has been by and large due to some small surpluses that have accumulated through the regional route between Banff and Canmore. And those surpluses become smaller and smaller as our budget gets tighter and tighter at the commission and our local transit matures. What I do hope to see is that the success of paid parking, in addition to improving the downtown core, really benefits locals at a more increased rate by improving and enhancing the local transit that we have. That regional route between Banff and Canmore is really only as successful as our local route is. They've become quite interdependent on each other. And so I would encourage administration and council as we move forward on this path to really consider how we can invest more within our local transit, which we know benefits locals more than it does tourists, although tourists use it, which is interesting because in Banff, their local transit does the exact opposite. It benefits tourists more than it does locals. So we really have an opportunity here to create a transit system that really serves our community through revenues derived from tourists. And it's a very rare thing that we have in Canmore to be able to do that. So I'm all for recommendation 4.
Is there other discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Thank you again to administration for all the work over the last several years to bring this forward and to work with the public and the business organizations. That's been a critical part of moving this ahead is that really intentional public engagement. So that's great. And I think that brings us to the end. I'll move council be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned.